Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you very much to this Professorial Inaugural Lecture. In welcoming you to the University of New South Wales, let me also pay my respect to the Bedegal people, the traditional custodians of the land, and I would pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Today we will hear from Professor Guy Marks, who's Professor of Respiratory Medicine here at UNSW. I would very much like to welcome Guy's family, his wife Maria, his daughter Lucy, and other members of his family who are here today. It is really a great opportunity for our new professors to deliver an inaugural lecture at the university, and it's a great opportunity for them to do so in the presence of their family, their peers from across the university. It is a new phenomenon here at the university. This is probably about the 12th lecture of this series that we've had at the university. It's something that, as I said, is a new thing that we've done. Many people have asked why we haven't done it before, because many other institutions do this as a matter of course when somebody is either appointed to a new chair or is promoted to a new chair, to give them the opportunity to at least tell the other members of the university, and in many cases a public lecture, what they actually do and something of the backstory behind how they got to where they are. So it's often an opportunity not just for an academic discourse, but actually to give some background. And the people who have delivered these lectures over the last several months now have been from all across the university, from all different disciplines. I actually think this is probably the first one from medicine that we've actually delivered, but they have been from every part of the university, and I think it has been such a warmly received event that it's something which has really got a critical mass. We are very, very proud of our professoriate, and as I said, this gives us a forum to hear from our new professors. At the end of the lecture, we will have an opportunity for drinks and some refreshments. I actually find that part of the evening, the afternoon, is also as valuable as the lecture, in the sense that people from all across the university have the opportunity to network and talk to each other. And if you like, it's the secondary benefit that we've managed to get from these professorial lectures. Now look, down to the business of the day. As I said, today's lecture is delivered by Professor Guy Marks, Professor of Respiratory Medicine. Guy is a respiratory physician and an epidemiologist and a public health physician. He's led respiratory and environmental epidemiology group at the Woolcock since 1997, and the major focus of his research is lung health, with a specific focus on airways disease, air pollution, and tuberculosis. He's also got a strong commitment to capacity building for lung research in Australia. He completed his medical degree, taking undergraduate studies in England and in Australia at the Prince of Wales and St Vincent's Hospitals. He then undertook studies towards a PhD under the supervision of Professor Anne Woolcock, and these studies included the development of a questionnaire for measuring the quality of life for people with asthma and clinical trials testing. He was awarded his PhD in 1993. He undertook postdoctoral studies at St Thomas's Hospital in London, where he was supported by the Lillian Roxon Memorial Travel Grant, the Asthma Foundation of Australia, and a travelling fellowship. Professor Marks returned to Australia in 1994 to take up a position as a staff specialist, a staff respiratory physician at Liverpool Hospital, a position that he still holds. He was head of the Department of Respiratory Medicine at Liverpool from 1994 to 2007, during which time the department grew from one staff specialist to one VMO, 10 staff specialists. So a dramatic increase of the capacity of that unit at Liverpool. In 1997, Professor Marks was awarded the Rolf Edgar Lake Postdoctoral Fellowship by the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Sydney, which allowed him to return part-time to the then Institute of Respiratory Medicine, where he was made head of the epidemiology group. He's held that position since that time. After that fellowship was complete, Professor Marks was awarded an NHMRC Practitioner Fellowship. He has academic appointments at the University of New South Wales, where he is Professor of Respiratory Medicine, and at the University of Sydney, where he is an honorary professor. During 2008, Professor Marks took a sabbatical leave as a respiratory with the European Respiratory Society. He visited many respiratory and epidemiology departments in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Guy Marks to deliver his inaugural lecture, whose title you will have to find, because I'm sure that Guy will deliver it. Will tell you the title of his lecture, which I just don't have in front of me at the moment. Guy Marks.
Thank you very much, Professor Field, for those kind words of introduction. I'd like to start also by acknowledging the Bedjigal people, the traditional custodians of this land, and by paying my respects to their elders past and present. So you've been looking at this photo for the last little while and wondering whose family this is. The old lady at the centre of this photo's name is Rosetta Pike. She was born in London in 1817, and she migrated to Sydney in about 1836 with her stepmother Abigail. Her brother had already come to Sydney some years earlier as a free settler. Her father, Mordecai Moses, who was my great-great-great-grandfather, had arrived in Sydney the year previously at the age of 58. He sadly had received a free passage to the country, courtesy of a magistrate at the Old Bailey who convicted him of forging Polish banknotes. And she came out to be with him, along with, in fact, her other siblings. There were 4 children. Fortunately for Mordecai, his son was very well connected in Sydney, as is the way, and in the tradition of this city, got him a good deal. He got a job as a sexton at the Jewish cemetery in Devonshire Street, which is the site of the current Sydney Railway. And fairly soon afterwards, he managed to get him a ticket of leave, and he was released from his status as a convict. This is Rosa. Rosa was married to Lewis Pike, who, after having 7 children with Rosa, ran off to New Zealand, apparently with his secretary, and left her with the 7 children, 4 of whom are seen here. This rather portly old man on the right here was my great-great-grandfather, whose name was George Bathurst Pike. He was born in Bathurst, and and this is him with his family and my grandmother here. His death certificate says that he was living in Randwick at the time when he died, and his death certificate also says that his occupation was a turf accountant, which I suspect is a euphemism. I just have a suspicion. And I might remind you that we stand actually on the grounds of the old Kensington racecourse. So I suspect that my ancestor was standing somewhere fairly close to where we're standing now, as he's in his occupation as a bookie. So this is a few people begat few people, and this comes to my parents. This is Colin and Sonia, my parents. Probably taken in about 1983, 2 years before my mother died at the age of 52. Both my parents were born in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, not that far from here, They made the most of very good opportunities that they had through good schools and the university. Both were highly intelligent, outward-looking, forward-thinking and liberal. My father was a lawyer, my mother was a French teacher and a university lecturer. My sister and I grew up in a house where humanism and reason were highly valued. It was a loving household. My childhood was safe, secure, and above all, it was happy, something which I think cannot be taken for granted. So, now you can all breathe. We all take it for granted. And we actually do breathing quite frequently and regularly, fortunately. In the words of the American Lung Association, quoted here, "When you can't breathe, nothing else matters." Sadly, many people in the world have lung diseases which mean that they can't breathe, or at least that they have trouble breathing. This diagram is called a tree map, and it's from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, who undertook the Global Burden of Diseases study. It shows the burden of disease here quantified according to all the different causes of diseases, quantified according to the number of healthy years of life lost due to each cause. That is, the sum of years of life lost due to premature death and years of life lived with disability. I think I'm going to be better with my glasses, so I can actually see what I'm doing here. In this graph, the orange colours represent the infectious or communicable diseases, and this is lower respiratory tract infections or pneumonia, which represents about 5% of all of the burden of disease. Tuberculosis representing about 2% of the total burden of disease. Here the blue colours are non-communicable diseases. Here is chronic respiratory disease, COPD and asthma, other chronic respiratory disease, also representing 5% of the total burden of disease. And here lung cancer, the highest burden of all of the cancers, representing 1.4% of all of the burden of disease. So I've spent my research career researching these high burden lung diseases. My interest in research on breathing problems started when I met Anne Woolcock in the late 1980s. Anne was perhaps the outstanding clinician researcher of her generation. She was an inspirational leader and mentor, and she introduced me to the problem of asthma and allergy and to some of the big questions of the day. In the 1980s and 90s, asthma was a big problem. The prevalence of asthma was rising. This is data from a series of 3 studies that were done in Belmont in New South Wales over at 10-year intervals, showing the rapid rise in the prevalence of diagnosed asthma and symptoms of asthma and of other manifestations of asthma, particularly between 1982 and 1992. This is a long-term trend plot for deaths due to asthma, and showing that in the 1970s and 80s, the number of deaths due to asthma was also rising. So there was considerable alarm at this time about the rising burden of asthma in Australia and globally. Effective treatment was available, but was not widely used or trusted. The problem was widely underestimated and dismissed. Studies conducted by Anne Woolcock with Jenny Peet and their team showed that house dust mite allergy was strongly linked to the presence of asthma and that allergen levels in Sydney were high. In experimental studies, the features of asthma could be induced and exacerbated by exposure to house dust mite allergen. We hypothesised that house dust mite allergen exposure in early life, when asthma begins for many people, then avoidance of that exposure might prevent asthma. Jenny, together with Linda Hodge, had also found that children who eat oily fish regularly were less likely to have asthma than those who did not. And this is Jenny Peet here, Ewan Tovey, who will be known to some of the people in the audience were important, and Brett Tolley here were important people in a lot of this early work. In 1995, Anne, Jenny, Steve Leader and myself, later joined by Craig Mellis, Ewan Tovey and Karen Webb, came up with the idea of a randomised controlled trial to test whether allergen avoidance and/or dietary fish oil supplementation actually did prevent asthma and allergy in high-risk children, the Childhood Asthma Prevention Study. Our team recruited 616 expectant mothers and subsequently their newborn infants who were at high risk of having asthma. They were randomised to active or control interventions for both the house dust mite avoidance and the diet interventions using this factorial design. We were successful, and this was implemented over the first 5 years of life in all of these children. It was a major undertaking. And with this major undertaking, we were successful in reducing exposure to house dust mite allergen by quite a substantial amount over a long period of time. And we were also successful in changing the levels of fatty acids in the blood in these children with our dietary intervention. But sadly, despite this success, we were not successful in preventing asthma. Neither the house dust mite avoidance intervention nor the diet intervention resulted in any significant reduction in the prevalence of any of the key outcomes of asthma, allergy or wheeze when the children were 5 years old. We did learn a lot from this study though. First, we learnt not to make recommendations for interventions before we have good evidence that they work. There were countless examples of interventions that seem like, in medicine, that seemed like a good idea at the time, but that proved to be ineffective, or in many cases worse, actually harmful when put in practice. Secondly, we learnt that it is possible to do large-scale, population-based randomised controlled trials of complex interventions. At that time, I believe this was the largest trial ever conducted amongst children in Australia. It gave me the confidence to go on and use this methodology to test other complex healthcare interventions and also, in fact, test the effect of environmental exposures. Before I move on from CAPS, I should say that this study did not end when the children were aged 5, and we did not just test these interventions. The children have been followed up and tested at regular intervals to age 14 and beyond. In collaboration with a diverse range of colleagues in a number of different disciplines, we have conducted and published research on allergy and allergic mechanisms, growth and development, genetics, breastfeeding, other aspects of childhood diet, air pollution, cardiovascular function and inflammation, sleep disorders and snoring, advanced statistical methods, and school academic performance. This has resulted in approximately 60 original research publications published so far. 3 PhDs have been conducted and several postdocs and visiting students have worked on this project. And we've also been funded, we've been fortunate to be funded by 5 consecutive NH and MRC project grants since 1996, as well as a CRC. So this has been a very major undertaking and I think we've learned quite a lot from it. I can't do justice to all of this work that I've just described here, but I will just share one of the intriguing findings. It's been known for a long time that young children with eczema tend to grow into older children with asthma and allergic rhinitis. Furthermore, eczema tends to be associated with food allergy, whereas asthma and rhinitis tend to be associated with allergy to inhaled allergens such as dust mites, pollens and moles. The conventional wisdom has been that there's been a so-called allergic march, food allergy leading to eczema, then leading to asthma. We looked at this in the CAPS cohort. We took all of the children who at age 18 months who were not yet allergic, atopic being the same as allergy, not children who were not allergic or atopic at age 18 months, And we divided them into those who had evidence of eczema and those who didn't have evidence of eczema at that time, at 18 months. By the age of 5 years, nearly half of those who'd had eczema at 18 months had gone on to develop allergy or atopy, whereas a smaller proportion of those who did not have eczema went on to develop atopy. So this suggests to us that, at least in some children with a family history of asthma, the allergic march does not proceed as has been previously thought, but that in fact that it's initiated by eczema, leading to allergy, and then subsequently to other disease manifestations such as asthma and rhinitis. This has important implications for understanding the mechanisms of allergic disease and focuses attention on defects in the skin barrier as a primary abnormality predisposing to allergic disease. This story has a lot further to run, and some of the accepted truths are being turned upside down. This is an example. Some colleagues in London, this is not my work, I must say, colleagues in London have recently shown in another randomised control trial that, contrary to popular belief, feeding children peanuts in early life rather than avoiding peanuts actually reduces the risk of peanut allergy in children who are at risk. So exposure is associated with a reduced risk. And we've shown something similar in our cohort, in our CAPS cohort, that children who acquired a pet cat, who had a pet cat in the household, were less likely to be allergic at 5 years than those who did not have a cat. As I say, I think this story has a long way further to run. Allergens are important though, and I'm going to give you an example of where allergens played a very important part in the etiology of asthma. We came across this spectacular example in Wagga in 1997. This is a weather radar of Wagga on the 30th of October 1997. On that night, a thunderstorm passed over the town, and there was a severe outbreak of attacks of asthma that affected this town and the surrounding districts on that one night. On one night, within space of a few hours in Wagga Wagga, 215 people attended the emergency department with attacks of asthma. 41 of them required admission to hospital and 2 people needed to be intubated. This was a disaster by anybody's reckoning. The hospital ran out of beds, equipment and drugs. Less severe episodes had been recognised previously and have occurred since, but this was certainly the most severe, and we investigated this issue. First, we conducted a case control study comparing people who attended the emergency department on that particular night associated with the thunderstorm with other people who attended with asthma at other times. And we found that many people who attended during this thunderstorm had had no previous history of asthma or had had a mild asthma. But we found that virtually all of them had a history of hay fever and were allergic on skin prick tests to pollens, to ryegrass pollen. We also found some clues to what might be protective, that those who were indoors were less likely to be affected, and that those who were taking regular inhaled steroids tended to be protected. It has been known for some time that pollen grains rupture on exposure to moisture, and they release these tiny submicronic particles that contain allergen in high concentration and are capable of being inhaled into the lower respiratory tract. And this was a strong link with ryegrass allergy, as I said. What was not clear as to what was the link with thunderstorms, particularly with some thunderstorms. I discussed this with John Colquhoun, who is a meteorologist at the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. He introduced me to this concept of thunderstorm outflows. These sweep across fields of ryegrass, a bit like one of those leaf blower things that you use to push along leaves. They suck up pollen grains and then force them down, having ruptured them to form these submicronic respirable allergenic particles, and concentrate the submicronic particles near the ground level. This is a recording of data from the Wagga Wagga Airport automatic weather station at the time of the storm. And you can clearly see here from the change in wind speed, wind direction, drop in temperature and the onset of rainfall when the thunderstorm came. It came at about 21:30. Two of my colleagues, George Carr and another colleague, Mervy Helmjuskoski, had been monitoring mould spores for another study that we were involved in Wagga Wagga at the time, with a spore trap on the roof of the hospital. They used this spore trap to count the pollen grains. And what this graph shows is the hourly pollen grain counts on that day. And here you can see, at the time of the arrival of the thunderstorm, right on cue, there is this 12-fold rise in the concentration of airborne airborne ruptured pollen grains, followed by a rapid decrease when the rain washed the air clean. And this dotted line shows the time of the first ambulance call on that night. So I think this line, this is a very neat demonstration, I think, of a chain of events that led to this catastrophe. We did some other work afterwards that suggested that although this was a very spectacular event, in fact epidemics like this were quite common, and that this thunderstorm outflows during spring and early summer were a common cause of epidemics of asthma exacerbations, particularly in Western New South Wales, Western Slopes. We can't, of course, change the weather, but we can prepare for it. As a result of this work, there are public health interventions in place to warn those at risk to use regular preventer medications, particularly during spring, and there's an alert system in place to advise hospitals when an epidemic is pending. This is some of my environmental epidemiology group, repairing to the pub, as we do. Repairing to the pub again, as we do. Okay, now I'm going to introduce you to tuberculosis. Tuberculosis has afflicted humans for millennia. Probably for as long as there have been humans, there has been human tuberculosis. And research on tuberculosis has played an important part in the history of medical research. This chap is neither a relative nor a colleague of mine. He was a former Prussian military officer, actually. His name is Robert Koch. In 1882, he discovered the tubercle bacillus and showed that this was the cause of the disease. He not only discovered the cause of the disease, but he developed a whole system of scientific thought and arguments known as Koch's postulates, which has underpinned progress of knowledge about the causes of the disease since that time. Therapy for tuberculosis has moved from sanatoria to various surgical interventions to antibiotic therapy. Streptomycin was one of the first antibiotics discovered in 1947, earning Selman Wax a Nobel Prize. And the studies designed to show its effectiveness were the first randomised controlled trials of drugs conducted in medicine. Here you can see the data from the study published in 1948, showing considerable improvement, 51% in the streptomycin group, 8% in the control group, a very dramatic demonstration of the benefit of streptomycin. Randomised controlled trials such as this have become the gold standard for demonstrating the effectiveness of new drugs. However, it soon became apparent that multi-drug therapy was required, and the British MRC began a long series of trials to find the optimal therapy. Unfortunately, despite the passage of 130 years since the discovery of the cause of tuberculosis, and nearly 70 years since the discovery of effective therapy, the disease remains a major cause of death and disability worldwide. It is estimated that 9 million people developed TB in 2013, but only 2/3 of them were actually diagnosed. Nearly 3 million cases were missed. Most people in Australia and in many other developed countries are surprised to hear that tuberculosis is still a problem. And this map shows why. It is not a problem in Australia or in the global north. It is a problem in the global south. There were 1.3 3 million deaths due to tuberculosis in 1.5 million deaths due to tuberculosis in 2013, including 80,000 in children. The failure to eradicate tuberculosis when we knew the cause and had the tools to do so is, in my view, one of the great failures of health policy and healthcare delivery of the 20th century. Now we have a new problem: multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. These are strains that are much more difficult to treat, much more toxic drugs required, much more expensive, and many people are not treated. About 500,000 people developed multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in 2013, and nearly half of those died. Very few of them got effective treatment. In some ways, we now need new drugs, new tools. In some ways, we're back to square one. We need new approaches, though, to the problem of TB, and we need to make sure that when we do get new tools and new drugs, that the next time around we have the policies and practices in place to make sure that they don't fail. My interest in tuberculosis began when I came to the Liverpool Chest Clinic in 1994, and I found myself, somewhat to my surprise, running a very large TB service in southwestern Sydney. Working with colleagues, we conducted some research using routinely collected data on refugees and migrants that had been screened for TB at Liverpool. In 2002, Nguyen Ling came to Sydney from Hanoi to do a PhD on tuberculosis with me. He introduced me to Dr. Si and my friend Dr. Nhung at the National Lung Hospital in Vietnam, and we began a collaboration that was very rewarding. This is with my other colleague, Professor Warwick Britton, and this is our good friend Robert Koch, who is in the grounds of the National Lung Hospital in Hanoi. In 2009, Greg Fox went to Vietnam to start his PhD, and from there our small team was established and grew. Our Woolcock Research Group in Vietnam focuses on problems of lung health, research on lung health. We try to focus on big picture questions that have implications for policy and for clinical and public health practice. In keeping with the research that we've done in Australia, we've concentrated on studies using high quality evidence or research methodologies, and we've also undertaken programs on capacity building. What we do not do, and this distinguishes from many other international organisations working in Vietnam and similar countries, is program implementation. We're focusing on research and on research training. Vietnam has a large population, 90 million people virtually, low income and very low healthcare expenditure. But several other development markers, such as life expectancy and adult literacy, are quite advanced. In contrast to Vietnam's 130,000 cases per year, Australia, by the way, has about 1,100 cases per year. Recent evidence from several countries, including studies in Vietnam, has established that one of the major impediments to progress in reducing the burden of tuberculosis is that many cases of the disease are simply not detected. Globally, it is estimated that 1/3 of all cases are not detected. In part, this is because some people with tuberculosis, perhaps half of all people with the disease, have few symptoms or do not recognise the symptoms of the disease, at least in its early stages. But despite not having symptoms, these people are still infectious to other people, and therefore they're responsible for spreading the disease to others. In addition, even when people do have symptoms, poor healthcare systems, particularly in many settings, particularly inadequate primary healthcare, mean that there are many barriers to being diagnosed with tuberculosis. And finally, even when tuberculosis is diagnosed, there are many impediments to getting people onto effective treatment and maintaining them on treatment for the 6-month period required to effect a cure. One way around these barriers is to actively seek cases by screening for the disease. This approach does not rely on symptoms to prompt health seeking and does not rely on the routine healthcare system to find cases. And you may recall that, you may not recall, but you may be aware that in the 1950s and 60s this was a common approach in many developed countries, including in Sydney, where these caravans run by the Anti-Tuberculosis Association. So we're doing two studies of active case finding in Vietnam. One is in household contacts, active case finding in household contacts. We're studying the impact of active case finding in household contacts of people diagnosed with pulmonary tuberculosis. We want to know how effective this is in finding additional cases, and we want to know what's the cost of it, and we want to know what are the barriers to its effective implementation. We are doing a cluster randomised controlled trial in which we've randomised 70 districts within Vietnam to 35 to active screening and 35 to control. And within the active screening districts, each person, the people with pulmonary tuberculosis have their household contacts screened at baseline and then at 6, 12 and 24 months. Whereas in the control district, we're not doing any special screening. So far, we've actually now finished this study and we're in the process of analysing it. We recruited 11,000 index patients, 11,000 people with tuberculosis, and studied 25,000 of their contacts and followed them up, as I said, for 2 years. In the active screening districts, 10,000 contacts were screened and 220, or 2.2% of them, were found to have TB. At the moment, we're doing some further analysis to work out how many of those cases, how many cases were found in the control group, so we can establish the benefit of this intervention. In November 2013, we opened our office in Hanoi, and we were very pleased that the Governor, Professor Marie Bashir, came to open our office for us, and that's the plaque that she unveiled. And this is Nguyen Tuong, who's the head of our country office in Vietnam. So, in Act 2, we're using this traditional method of screening using chest radiology. And this is, as I said, what was used to be used in caravans. However, there are a lot of limitations to using chest x-rays, one of which is the need to move large caravans around on difficult roads and have access to electric power and so on. In Act 3, we've adopted an alternative screening approach. Expert MTB is a PCR-based diagnostic test that was developed as a result of a product development partnership through support from not-for-profit sector. It, I think, is revolutionising the field of TB diagnostics, and I believe will eventually render the traditional tests of sputum microscopy and TB culture, which have been around since the time of Robert Koch, 120 years, will render these obsolete. It's being rapidly deployed as a diagnostic test, but our innovation was to use it as a potential screening tool. In Act 3, we're seeking to test the effectiveness of annual community-wide screening of a population for TB using this expert testing of sputum to reduce the prevalence of TB. The study is being conducted in Cà Mau province, the southernmost province in Vietnam, a remote farming and fishing community with a high prevalence of TB. This is again a cluster randomised controlled trial. In this case, the clusters are villages or sub-communes, each with a population of about 1,000 people. 60 villages are being randomised to the active intervention and are screened annually for 4 years. In the final year, we'll screen both the active and the control villages and compare the prevalence of TB and of TB infection between these two groups. This is just a map of the whole province showing the 980 villages or subcommunes and where we've selected the active and the control ones. Screening in Kamau usually takes about 2 weeks. It begins with a household census where we make appointments. The field workers visit each person to gain their consent, ask simple questions and ask them to produce a sputum specimen for testing. We've developed this detailed set of instructions on how to produce a sputum specimen, and the data are collected online using this online collection tool that we've developed with a South African company. It uses Android mobile phone and also records information on geocoding and QR code scanning. It was a pretty good 3G network, but sometimes the workers have to go to extreme measures to get the signal. I guess we do need the signal. Once collected, the specimens, this is in collecting data in a fishing village you can see here. Once collected, the specimens are transported by motorcycle or riverboat back to our laboratory for testing. This is a very precarious looking investigator here, feeling uncomfortable about the prospect of falling into the drink. This is the effects of climate change. This was last Friday, in fact, last Thursday, outside our office in Kamau City. And this is regularly underwater, and the whole of this southern area of Vietnam will be underwater within a short period of time, I suspect, due to climate change. Okay, we have a number of other studies underway in Vietnam. Some are connected with these two, others are independent of them. All of our work is done in close collaboration with the National TB program. That's partly why we can't do radiology using a caravan. It would be somewhat difficult. Okay. We're also interested in developing research capacity. As I mentioned, our work is designed to develop the research capacity in both Australian researchers interested in global health research and in Vietnamese researchers. In addition to research higher degrees, we are also conducting short courses on research methods in Vietnam. We've been conducting an annual one-week course in collaboration with US and local Vietnamese colleagues each year since 2011. The courses are designed to identify and train future leaders to instill a sense of respect for evidence as a basis for policy and practice, and to impart basic research skills, particularly focusing on formulating research questions. In my view, the focus of these courses is to assist them to ask the right questions and to work out how best to answer them, to find a way to implement the research projects and to report it in a way that people will learn from the answer. Make sure that people hear the answer. Each year we have between 30 and 50 participants, and now some of those who participated in the early years are teaching in the program. This is just one of the elements of our research capacity building work in Vietnam. So this was actually the title that I gave, and I also forgot the title, so that's why I didn't tell you. But it's here now. Okay. To finish, I'll return to the rather grandiose title that I gave this lecture. I hope the brief vignettes that I presented here today have given you some insight into the 5 pillars that sustain my approach to this endeavour. Firstly, focusing on big problems that cause the greatest burden of disease. In the field of lung disease, that's chronic respiratory disease, asthma and COPD, tuberculosis and pneumonia. Secondly, since the lungs are our main interface with the airborne environment, we need to focus on keeping it clean. And that's why I've looked at air pollution, allergens and infections that are airborne. Thirdly, we need to make sure that we develop policy and practice based on the best quality evidence. And the study that I showed you at the beginning was reason to why we need to use develop policy based on strong evidence. Fourthly, collaboration, in my view, is the key. I've always tried to work with people who bring skills and expertise that I don't have. And since there's an enormous number of skills that I don't have, in fact my range of skills is very limited, I've had to work with a lot of people. And I found that a very satisfying aspect of my career. And finally, mentoring a new generation of researchers, clearly an important hope for the future, to solve all those problems that we haven't been able to fix. Just finally, I'll finish with, this is my next generation. To finish on a personal note, I'm very proud to have my wife and my daughter Lucy here with me tonight. My other two daughters who are in this photo but are not here tonight, Eliza and Beatrice, are currently overseas. They're pursuing their dreams. I'm also very proud to have my sister Susan here. Susan's Professor of Law at the London School of Economics. And I can say that 180 years after our great-great-great-grandfather was convicted at the Old Bailey, Susan is finally back down the road at the Strand teaching the Brits about the law. I'll finish on that note. Thank you.
Professor Field, I've been told to address you, but I will address the audience as well. But Professor Field, what you have heard this evening is something very important, and it's this. There remain problems in medicine that are very difficult. The reason for the endeavour in medical science is that physicians every day see before them problems which are not yet soluble. From time to time, the place of the thinking, investigative clinician is at risk. And in Sydney, I often see the perils of distraction of private practice and avarice interfering sometimes with the thought of the physician doing the best for his patient. It's also apparent from this tour de force this evening from Professor Marks that there are still some fundamental issues at stake in medical science. Professor Field, you'll be shocked to hear that 300 years ago physicians thought they knew best as to what to do to their patients. And in those times, it was frequently much more dangerous to go to a physician than not. His therapies were often harmful and often lethal. In the Napoleonic Wars, French surgeons wondered whether bleeding wounded soldiers on the battlefield was a good idea. So two of them embarked on a short study where they randomized cases to bleeding or not bleeding in a sequential design and showed, to the great amazement of some of the European brethren, that bleeding wounded soldiers produced a 20-fold increase in mortality. When the late professors of Oxford considered the causes of lung cancer, and here I'm thinking particularly of Richard Doll, he also asked questions of the field and said, I think my intuition is that it's the cars and the exhaust fumes that's causing this extraordinary epidemic of lung cancer in Britain, but I'm not sure, so I'd better do a study. And so he set up a study, and to some surprise, it turned out that cigarette smoking, rather than the exhausts of Rovers and Jaguars, was the cause of the epidemic of lung cancer in Britain. Professor Field, tonight we have had a genuinely high-quality review of a superb career in medical science. I'm very proud to have heard the lecture and to commend this lecture to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Phillips, and thank you very much, Professor Marks. I don't need to be convinced. It was a superb exposition this evening, and I think Professor Marks has really demonstrated the impact of the research that he's undertaken. And one of the things that stands very prominent in the strategy for taking this university forward into the future is to focus on the research which actually has impact. And I don't think there's any better way to demonstrate the sort of impact that the research that we do here at UNSW has than in a lecture just like this one. A superb exposition. Like the lectures that have gone before in this series, Professor Marks has set an exceptional standard. They have all been exceptional lectures from exceptional people who are absolutely passionate about the work that they do, whether it's in medicine or in economics or in law or in the social sciences. The one thing that really does come across in the inaugural lectures is the absolute passion and conviction of our professoriate, and that's something of which we are very, very proud. Ladies and gentlemen, just two things to say before we close up. Firstly, the next lecture in this series will be given in about 2 weeks' time on the 2nd of October at 4 p.m. Over in the council chambers, and it will be given by Professor Marcus Groth of the School of Management in the Business School, and he's talking about the value of a smile, the impact of emotions in customer service. And now for something completely different, but absolutely, as I said, every one of the lectures has been just absolutely stimulating in the depth and the passion that gets presented. The other thing I should do is to invite you to spend at least a little while enjoying some refreshments. There'll be drinks and refreshments at the back of this hall immediately after this lecture. Look, it just remains for me to thank Professor Marks and Professor Phillips. Professor Marks for delivering what has been a wonderful lecture this afternoon, and welcoming him to the professoriate at UNSW. Thank you very, very much.